Brilliant. So hopefully you've done the title. So as I say, our first lesson is going to set the scene, because Jack the Ripper, as I said, stalked the East End of London in 1888. And what we've got to think about over this course of lessons is, why on earth did this man get away with it? Why on earth did we not find out who he was? And a lot of it was to do with the time he committed the crimes in 1888 and where he did this. And this was in the East End of London. So the first thing we're going to do is actually going to watch a little film clip that's going to tell us a bit more about what the East End of London was like. So what I would like you to do, please, underneath your title, as we're going through the clip, it's about 6 minutes long, can you give me as much information as possible? And you can bullet point this. You do not need to have long sentences, but bullet pointed pieces of information about what the East End of London was like. Now, the West End of London was very wealthy. It was where the rich lived, the middle classes lived. It was where the theatres and the shops were. But the East End of London was very, very different. So as we show our clip, write as much information down, bullet pointed as you can, which will help us to understand what the East End of London was like and why it would have been so easy for Jack the Ripper to get away with his crimes. Oh, scaffolding. Yeah. And down to the beard, sorry. Yeah. You just unmute yourself. Just look around. Yeah, on the left. Mute.
In the autumn of 1888, a series of brutal murders in the East End of London lit a flame that sent shockwaves reverberating around the civilized world and caused a scandal that struck right at the heart of the British establishment. London in 1888 was the world's largest capital city. Queen Victoria sat upon the throne of England and ruled an empire that was ever expanding. She had recently celebrated 50 glorious years as monarch. Her subjects seemed confident, entrepreneurial and determined. The City of London, the financial boiler room that powered the empire and its expansion, reflected the supreme confidence of the age. Yet right on its doorstep lay the district of Whitechapel, a sordid, crime-ridden quarter where vice, violence and drunkenness flourished, and where 76,000 residents lived in abject poverty.
The East End really was outcast London. In 1883, when the chairman for the London school boards did a report, he reported that out of sort of 1,129 families, 871 of them were living in rooms just one room big, and up to 9 people per room.
Whitechapel had the capital's worst slums, worst overcrowding and highest death rates. It was also the immigrant district, and the 1880s had seen a huge influx of Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Russia, Poland and Romania. Parts of Whitechapel had the appearance of a foreign town, whose inhabitants, mostly lower-class Jews, spoke their own language and dressed differently to the other citizens of the East End.
There was a very large Jewish community in the East End. There had been a huge immigration into the East End in 1880s. The immigrants were living in a way that was different to the Gentile population, and a lot of the Gentile population resented that. Not so much resented the fact that these people were Jewish, although there was anti-Semitism.
Inevitably, this led to a certain amount of racial tension, as these immigrants were accused of taking English jobs and English homes. But whether they were Jew or Gentile, all those who lived in the area shared one thing in common: life was a daily battle for survival.
The area was terribly overcrowded. People lived crammed together in miserable circumstances, in absolutely dire poverty.
All arches damp and dripping, and there was sort of straw on the floor and lots of horse dropping, all horses everywhere.
The area was very, very grim, very poverty-stricken. There's no sanitation. There's just off the main highways and byways, you've got loads of alleyways and courts with people just throwing out their sewage and their rubbish. I mean, the stench must have been awful in the East End.
For the poor and destitute, the main accommodation was offered by the common lodging houses. There were 233 of them in Whitechapel, and each night 8,500 men, women and children sought shelter within their decaying walls.
Now, if you were in a common lodging house, because of course nobody could afford their own sort of flat or house, it would cost you 8p for a double bed, 4p for a single one, and if you couldn't afford that, for 2p you could go to sleep standing up, lined up against a rope, stretched from one side of the room to the other, and hundreds of men, women and children did that every night in Whitechapel.
For the women, there were few career opportunities, and those that were available paid a pittance, barely enough to cover the cost of a bed in a common lodging house, and certainly not enough to pay for food as well. So many of them turned to prostitution, not out of any real choice, but out of a necessity to survive.
The Met actually sort of estimated that there were over 1,200 prostitutes of a very low class actually working in Whitechapel.
On the surface, Victorian London may have seemed supremely confident and eminently respectable, but beneath that surface there lurked a general feeling of extreme unease.
In the 1880s, you had all these different fears and anxieties, and this kind of social fear, really, of things that were going on, the changes to the ordered society that the middle classes and the upper classes were so used to. And it was a period where a lot of people were frightened. There was a genuine fear that there was going to be a revolution. The East End came to be the focus for all of that anxiety, all of that social anxiety. Jack the Ripper came along at just the right time, in just the right place, and he frightened people in the same way as all these other fears were frightening people. And so Jack the Ripper, in many ways, became the embodiment, the physical embodiment of all of those anxieties. If the Ripper could step across the border from the poverty-stricken, immoral East End and infect the rest of London, then so could all of these other kind of nebulous fears spill across and bring about an awful lot of social unrest and social change. But the fact is that it did penetrate the consciousness of the people in a way that an ordinary murderer hadn't done in the past and would never do again.
Okay, guys, so hopefully you got a lot of information there. And one of the main things I hope you've realised is we're talking about the East End of London and an area of the East End known as Whitechapel. So it'd be really great if you could get on the chat now and put some ideas in, things that you actually learned from that little piece of video, things that you can add to our list so we can try to help each other. So let's go through a few of the things that we could have said. So one of the things you could have said that they had terrible housing and they were known as slums. So slum housing, really bad conditions. You might also want to have said that there was about 871 families that lived in one room. That's all they had. And that could be up to 9 people in a room. You might also want to say that it's known for its violence. It was known for lots of people being drunk all the time. And you had a lot of immigrants. This was people coming from other countries. In some cases, just looking for a better life. But in the case of the Jews, it was to look for a place where they weren't being persecuted. So you're going to have a lot of different type of ethnic backgrounds within this very, very small area of London. It was incredibly poor. There was high unemployment. And one of the things that's going to be really, really important to us is that a lot of the women could not afford anything at all and turned to prostitution just to make a few pennies a day to buy a bed for the night. So I hope we've got lots and lots of ideas, and this is starting to set the scene about why Jack the Ripper could possibly get away with these murders and why he would have chosen Whitechapel as the place to commit his murders. So we're going to go on now. So have a little look at this. I would like you, please, just to spend a couple of minutes, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, having a look at the picture and again, seeing what does this picture tell us about conditions in London, and pick up maybe 3 or 4 points from the picture, and can you add it to your list, please? I'm going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes. So for example, we can see in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got what looks like a cooking pot. So this might suggest to us that some people were actually just living on the streets with no homes to go to. So 2 or 3 minutes, and maybe if you could get maybe 3 or 4 points down to add to your previous list. Yeah. We've got some really good ideas so far, people on the chat. Absolutely right. There are a lot of children. There were lots of children about, which does suggest that people were having endless amounts and they couldn't afford to feed them. That was a really good one. Life was very scary. Life was very overcrowded. People were living in a lot of poverty. So some really good ideas coming out. I'm just going to give you 1 more minute. Okay, so let's have a little look what we can see from this picture. Well, I think first of all, we could probably see that in the top left-hand corner, the artist's drawing is very, very dark, which perhaps suggests that this could be very scary. I don't think it's a street that we'd like to walk down in the daytime, let alone at nighttime. There's no evidence of any street lighting at all, so this would have been really black, shadowy, tiny, narrow streets, very, very scary. We can also see there's lots of people just sitting around on the street, and one of you mentioned in the chat there was a lot of children. We've already said that. Again, suggesting there's nowhere for these people to go. Look at what they're wearing. They're wearing rags. It seems to be very overcrowded. And what you may be able to tell from the picture is they also seem to be different ethnic groups here, suggesting that there's a lot of immigrants, there's a lot of people from other countries coming to live at Whitechapel at this point. We've mentioned the cooking pot already, and you might also see on the right-hand side what looks like a part door sort of broken off. So you can see also that the houses were not very good. In actual fact, they were really pretty much held together, and they wouldn't have been very pleasant to live in, even if you did have somewhere else to live. So hopefully you've got a nice long list now, and we can start to think, why was this a great place for Jack the Ripper to commit his crimes? Why would this be good? Why would he be able to get away with killing people and no one find him? So have a look and think about what's going on. So just a few things to think about. A little summary so far before we move on. London was a divided city. We've got the rich in the west, we've got the real poor in the east. And like today, the East End was much, much poorer, and particularly Whitechapel. And so we can start to think about the types of problems that are going to help Jack the Ripper commit and get away with murder. So, as we mentioned right at the beginning, we're looking at Jack the Ripper, and he is what's called a serial killer. He is going to kill at least 5 women that we know about. And one of the problems was that the police could not catch him. Now, this was for several reasons. First of all, we don't have a database that the police would have today. So Jack the Ripper could have been killing in other countries, other places in England, and we would not have known about it in London. We don't have any technology. We certainly didn't have things like DNA, but we can't even test for fingerprints. And one of the things that the police thought was that if you took a photograph of the victim's eye, you would see the reflection of the killer. And of course, we know that would be nonsense, but this is the type of understanding that the police have at this point in time. So what we're going to do next is have a little look further at some sources to, I suppose, increase our knowledge to help us understand why this would be an ideal place for Jack the Ripper. So, can you please set yourself up? I'm going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes to set yourself up. Now, you can do this in 2 ways. You can either create a little mind map. So have a look at the table on the screen. You could have living in Whitechapel in the 1880s and a little bubble in the middle, and then 5 major headings coming out from that bubble. Or if you've got a ruler handy and you wish to, you could just set yourself up with a table. But you've got to have the 5 headings: employment, people, alcohol, pollution, and housing. So as I said, I'm going to give you about 3 or 4 minutes possibly just to set yourself up with a table or a little mind map ready to have a look at some sources and get even more knowledge as to why Whitechapel was the ideal place for Jack the Ripper to kill his victims.
Okay, hello guys. So I'm obviously sharing the lesson today with Mrs. Eason. Can I just remind everyone who has logged in to keep all the chat relevant, because it is monitored, and just keep it relevant. And because this is a live lesson, it's different to working through a pre-recorded lesson, which you've been used to doing. This is being recorded, the lesson, so you will be able to go back and watch it, and you will be able to look back at those bits that you weren't sure of at the time, okay? So if you're thinking that you don't get it, yeah, you will have time to look back on it, because obviously the lesson isn't due immediately after this live is finished. You will have a little bit of time to finish it off, okay? And well done those of you that are keeping up with the chat. Mrs. Gray is involved in the chat, and she's kind of answering a lot of your questions as well. So I'm going to pick up where Miss Eason left off. So we've looked at what the environment was like in the East End of London, in Whitechapel in particular. And now we're going to look at some of the issues which you've already kind of picked up on, but you've got your mind map ready. And we're going to look at a couple of sources. Now the sources were attached to show my homework as well. Some of you might have them ready, printed out. If not, they will come up on the screen, so do not worry. There's going to be a bit of, I'm going to do a bit of modelling of answers of how to go about this next bit, and then you're going to have a little bit of time to complete some of the sources yourself. Okay, so you've got your 5 headings: employment, people, alcohol, housing, and pollution. Okay, and these are the headings we're going to work with. Now, moving on to the next slide. Okay, so you have these sources as well, but you don't need to look at those. You can look at them on here. We're going to use the sources now to help us find out about life in Whitechapel in the 1800s. Now, source A, let's have a look at it. How are we going to do this, actually write this information down? So source A is a photo of when the terrible smog from the factories got so thick that you couldn't see a metre in front of you. This was called a P super because the smog was a greenish colour. Now, you know already from studying the Industrial Revolution that in the 1880s, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. You know, the factories were pumping out smoke, and this was London, remember, so there was a lot of activity going on in London in terms of industry. And then if the weather conditions were an issue at the same time, you got this kind of atmosphere. Now, you need to think about what heading would you link this source to? Now, if I was doing this personally, I would probably consider using or linking this to the heading pollution, because this is clearly one that suggests pollution was a problem in the East End of London that would potentially, you know, help, sadly, crimes be committed. And you think, so what can you get from this? So if I was doing this, I would suggest that it would make the atmosphere very dark. It would potentially reduce visibility, all right, and it would make the actual atmosphere and the environment pretty difficult to live in. Okay, so you would put in the pollution box source A, and you could write a sentence about pollution at the time based on this source. All right. Okay. Now heading on to source B, just to work this as another example for you. So source B this time is a photo of the housing in Whitechapel. Now it's back-to-back housing. That shouldn't be new to you. If you can, type something into the chat to Mrs. Gray about that. Back-to-back housing was a very common type of housing in the 1880s, you know, and it meant the housing was very close together. This would be mean everybody was bunched up and living in one place, and there wasn't a huge amount of open space. There were no big green spaces, not in this part of London, all right. There were small narrow streets, as you'll see in a couple of the other sources, and so this source potentially we would use under the housing category, all right, and we could talk about overcrowding, okay, as one thing that this source tells us. So all you're looking for here is which heading would you use this source under, and something that you can learn from the source about what it was like at the time, okay? So just have a quick catch up on those. And we will move on to the next source. Okay, remember you can always go back and look at this if you're stuck. Okay, guys. So I'll do source C with you, and then I will give you a few minutes to have a look at the other sources yourself. So this is an interesting one. This is Christ Church. The source C we're talking about, this is source C we're talking about here, and it is a graveyard, or its graveyard was known as Itchy Park. Bit of a strange name, you'd think, but it was a nickname given to the graveyard because of all the homeless people who would sleep there, who were covered in lice. Now those simple statements give us such kind of a lot of information about what it was like in the East End of London, what the conditions were like. Now the fact that this has the word homeless in it, we could potentially link this to the housing category, all right, which suggests that not everybody had a house, so there were homeless people. All right, and also we could comment on the fact that it was the conditions in which people lived in, so the housing conditions or lack of housing conditions were really, really poor. And it caused health problems for people, as you can see from this. So just that one picture does give us quite a bit of information about what it was like in Whitechapel. So I would link that one to housing. Now, I'm going to pause for about 5 minutes, all right? I would like you to look at source D, so I won't push the slide on just yet. This is a map of the maze-like streets and roads. Think about which heading you would use that under, and what information it tells us. Then I move the slide on to the next sources, and I want you to have a go at those, and I will chip back in a couple of minutes' time. If you're stuck or you've got any questions, pop them into the chat, or any ideas as well, so that we can see how you are doing. Okay, guys, so I'm just going to move the slide on. Some great points coming up in the chat. And remember, you might not agree with me which heading you put, and you would put a source under. So by all means, if you can use it under a different heading and it works for you, then that's absolutely fine. Okay. Have a look at these next 4 sources. Remember, just decide where do they fit, which category do they come under, and maybe pick up one thing that you learn or can infer or guess, which means work out from the source. Again, a few minutes. I'll go quiet for a few minutes while you do that, but keep up asking questions in the chat with Mrs. Gray. Okay, how you doing? How you all doing there? Hopefully you can work out, kind of gives you an idea then of what kind of category this works. So the one I like on here is this one, source F, because I feel that source F talks about one of the big issues at the time, which was alcoholism. All right, you know, you think one small section of a road in 1888 had 6 pubs. That would mean a lot of people would be frequenting pubs. And if you consider the conditions in which people lived, you know, the poor housing, then you know, it only stands to reason that some people are going to turn to drink and that alcoholism is going to become a problem. Okay, so just have a look at that for another minute to make sure you've covered those 4 sources. Just want to point out as well, guys, on this one, this source, oh, moved on to the next one. Hang on, let's go back, sorry. Just want to point out on this one, this source here. This is a workhouse. So this is a place where people went if their lives became so bad that perhaps they had nowhere to live sometimes, or if they'd lost their work or they were too sick to work, they would go to a workhouse. And conditions in a workhouse are really tough, you know, and it's not a place you really wanted to end up. So if you're in the workhouse, you were pretty destitute, which means absolutely, you know, poverty-stricken. You had nothing, you had nothing left in life. And because unemployment was really high in the 1880s, very often people did end up in the workhouse. So there's a bit of a feature, there's a bit of a factor there about unemployment and workhouse conditions. Remember, what we're doing here is looking at the whole big picture of the East End and Whitechapel in particular. Okay. Okay, I'm going to move the slide, move this PowerPoint onto the next slide so that we can look at the final couple of sources. All right, but remember, you can come back to this to add to it. Okay, so here we have the last slide. And this has the final 3 sources on it. And this kind of brings in some of the other key issues that perhaps you haven't written much about yet, particularly source J, this one here, is of importance. It says Whitechapel was the home of London's immigrant population. People mistrusted the 50,000 Jews that moved there in the mid-late 1800s. There's obviously issues between different communities in society. Okay, so you had perhaps race issues at the time, and you had a situation where people didn't trust one another, and it's important to understand that so you get a feel for the East End and what it was like. So think about which category would you put source J with, and what one piece of information can you get from it? And just very quickly looking at source K, all right, and this seems to be a bit of a theme coming up. One of the key issues in the East End of London, particularly in Whitechapel, was the issue of prostitution, of women turning to sort of, their lives had become you know, so difficult in some ways, they had to turn to selling themselves in order to make some money. And it was really frowned upon, but at the same time, it was a common feature in the East End of London, and it meant that again, you know, there were women out on the streets, vulnerable women who perhaps were in situations, you know, and when you put it all together with the housing and the maze of streets and the actual visibility issues, you can see why the East End of London was a very interesting place for criminal activity. Okay, guys, 2 minutes to finish off jotting down a couple more points in your boxes or on the mind map. Okay, guys, I noticed there's a couple of issues, or one or two of you say you can hear perfectly well. Some of you are saying there's beeping. I do put myself up, we do put ourselves on mute sometimes when you're getting on with the task. So it could be an issue to do with that, perhaps. But hopefully there haven't been many people saying that it's that the sound is an issue. But so yeah, any feedback is great in terms of the technicalities of all of this. Okay, so now I'd like to think that you have got something that goes with each category. So you've developed a picture now of the East End of Whitechapel, the issues to do with perhaps the communities that lived in Whitechapel. If I just take us back to this slide where we were here. this slide. So the issues to do with the people and the community and the difficulties perhaps, and the lack of trust between people who lived in a community was one issue. Alcoholism was definitely a problem, okay? Some of you have said in the chat about issues of drunkenness, could lead to all sorts of issues. It could lead to crime, it could lead to fighting, and so therefore that was a bit of a problem at the time. The housing that people lived in was desperate in some circumstances. And of course, you know, people going, you know, back to their houses day in and day out would have been distressing for people because the conditions as well they lived in could cause health problems. Pollution was an issue. You know, it wasn't a sort of, you know, it wouldn't always be sunny, it wouldn't always be light and bright. And so therefore with the smog as well, it would mean that it could be dark and dingy in those maze-like streets in Whitechapel. And finally, unemployment was an issue, or a lack of employment was an issue. And of course, that would mean that people would be struggling to get their next pay packet, to get money, to get their next meal, and people would turn to crime sometimes, or people would turn to do things in their lives perhaps they wouldn't choose to do, but they felt that they were desperate and had no other choice. Okay, so we'd like to think that at the start of the lesson, your knowledge on Whitechapel was perhaps limited, but now you've got a bit of a better idea of what it was actually like. You know, what kind of area are we dealing with? This was remember, setting the scene for Jack the Ripper, all right, and where he operated. And so now you can see what it was like. Okay, right, guys. So I'm going to take us to this last but one slide. All right, and this is your final little task today. Now, what we're going to do is, in a moment when we finish, we're going to let you do this after this lesson has finished, okay? But it is due in by today. Now, this is a question: why was Whitechapel so good for crime in the 1880s? And you're going to submit this as a Google Doc. Now, I'll show you that quickly in a moment. You've got a short piece of narrative to write, which is answering that question. And if you use the structure that's on the screen in front of you, all right, you will get a decent mark for this. Your introduction to this is setting the scene, but only in a sentence or two. You know, where was Whitechapel? What was it like? Just give a very brief idea. The question asking you is, why was it so good for crime? Your next section is giving reasons why Whitechapel was so good for crime. All right, and in total, you're going to give 3 reasons, and you're going to use your mind map or your grid that you have completed, all right, and the sources that you've used to help you decide. So it might be that you suggest Whitechapel was so good for crime because of the housing setup, because of the maze-like streets, all right, because it would be easy for a criminal to hide in those streets, or because of the pollution, because it was dark and dingy, and it would mean that, you know, people wouldn't be seen committing their crimes and they could get away with it much easier. I want you to come up with 3 reasons why it was so good for crime. And in conclusion, you need to sum up with a sentence in your own words. Why was Whitechapel such an area that has a high level of criminal activity? And this is set in the scene for the Jack the Ripper story that you will start doing in your lessons at home next week. Now, very quickly, I just want to, hopefully this will go to the link. Just so that you were aware, on the PowerPoint and in Show My Homework, there is a link to the Google Doc that I would like you to fill in. What I would like you to do, please, guys, is submit your answer by typing it up into the Google Doc and then clicking submit. And once it's submitted, it'll come to me and I will be able to mark it for you, okay? This question is worth 8 points, and it's a very sort of GCSE style question in a way, all right, which you are more than capable of doing. Okay, so what I'm going to do with that then is, once we say goodbye to you in a moment, that is something that I want you to do yourself before, you know, you leave your computer. Really, you may as well get on with it now, and then we'll expect them to sort of arrive in the next couple of hours and things, so I can get you your scores back. The last thing on here is a link, if you wish to do it, wish to use it, to a YouTube video about Jack the Ripper. If you're interested in this topic and you know you want to find out more about it, there's an optional link that you can watch. You do not have to watch this, guys, if you don't want to. But if it's something that you're interested in, then the option is there to do that. Okay, are there any last minute questions before we go? All right, just type them quickly into chat. Just with the Google form, remember it is to be done on the Google form. It's not in your books, just to confirm. All right, I can mark it really easily on the Google form, and then I will send you an email back with your score and your feedback. Okay, so you do not need to write out that final question in your book. Okay, you don't need to even write it in your book as a draft. You can just type it straight up into Google Forms. All right. Okay, there's no more questions. All right, any last minute things you might need Mrs. Gray or myself to say to you about? And don't forget, this will be recorded. I'll obviously share the link with you so that you can watch it back if you need to, and you can then add anything to your work. All right, but it is brilliant to see some of you, lots of you are sending in work. Keep sending in evidence of your work, and even do that today with the mind map you've done, but the final questions to be on Google Docs. Okay? Right? Okay, guys, we'll say goodbye now and sign out, and we will speak to you soon. Okay.